Welcome everyone. Good to have you here, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. And thanks to you for being here, spending your Friday night at a tech conference, which is pretty cool, I think. Again, my name is Nick. I work as a principal interaction designer at a Dutch company called Mirabeau, which, despite having a French name, is actually a Dutch company. We like to call ourselves a digital agency, like many others do nowadays. So where some companies or agencies tend to focus on user experience or design, and other companies tend to focus on maybe technology, we like to do both. So we employed a lot of user experience designers, but also we have a lot of expertise when it comes to cloud computing and machine learning and all those kind of things. And we sort of operate at the intersection of design and technology, because we really believe in the inherent value of bringing together creatives but also technologists. But I'm not going to talk too much about Mirabeau today, because I have more important things to talk about. Because I do believe we have some kind of problem, and basically the problem, for me at least, looks like this. Whenever I put down my phone for maybe 30 minutes or an hour and I return to it, it usually looks like this. So there's lots of notifications, there's new email incoming, Twitter mentions, Facebook updates, Slack channels. There's so much information to process, and it keeps me busy all the time. And I'm guessing the same is true for you, because we're all in technology, right? So we're basically confronted with what I call the never-ending fire hose of information. There are so many things coming at us, and it's really getting crazy. So I think as user experience designers, we have the power to solve this problem together by creating more smarter products and services that take into account anticipate the need of the user. And in order to sort of require less management and less user interface and less hassle, basically. Because if we look at our industry in general, it is fair to say that we spend a lot of time polishing design and polishing interfaces. We sweat the details when it comes to topography. We spend weeks finding the perfect grid, which is all fair and nice, but I think it sometimes gets us to overlook the bigger fundamental design challenges. I think these are just a few weather apps for the iPhone, and there's actually just one of them that really managed to solve the problem, which is, do I need an umbrella or not? So the design goal as designers and developers becomes to use technology and data and input from sensors and what we have about previous behavior and all kinds of things to really optimize the design and automate as much as we can. So instead of asking users to do stuff by hand manually through an interface, we can use all this magical emerging technology to take away some of the manual effort. So in the end, that should lead to less work for end users, but I think you'll agree that as designers and developers, we're only getting more work, because we have to come up with the algorithms, the systems, and the designs that really make this work. It's, again, kind of nerdy, but it's still really, really interesting, I think. There are, of course, many companies out there nowadays that try this, to try to work with artificial intelligence, with anticipatory design, and I think Google is a good example. They use whatever info they have on you or your profile to, in this case, serve up relevant advertising. But also there's products like Google Now, for example, that take into account your calendar, your schedule, your email, and whatever info they have on you to, in this case, show when you need to leave for work. I did another version of this talk recently in Warsaw, which is pretty cool. And the funny thing I ran into when I did that, we got to my hotel in Warsaw and I looked up the address of the venue. Google showed me this page in Polish because, well, it assumed, because I was based in Poland or Warsaw, that I was probably a Polish person, which doesn't make much sense, of course. But in this case, it was more like a minor inconvenience. But it just shows that despite having like brilliant designers and brilliant engineers, even companies like Google sometimes screw up and they get my context wrong. In this case, it was more like a minor inconvenience, but sometimes when Google or other companies get context mixed up, it's kind of awkward. In this case, advertising in video. Well, then there's companies like Netflix and Amazon, for example, that take into account the things you're reading, the movies you like, and other stuff to recommend new books or new movies. So they're also using contextual design in that regard. And then there's, of course, Facebook, who use your likes, your location, whatever info they have on you to present you with a highly sort of customized timeline. So at some point you can argue that it's mostly tech companies from Silicon Valley who have the power and the capabilities to really make this contextual design work. Whereas if you look at the broader industry, then many agencies and many designers work on digital products and services that are actually more like television. They're sending the same user interface, the same design, the same content to each and every device. And there's very little customization, which is, well, not so good maybe. So let's look at some different kinds of context we have today. Of course, the most obvious one is screens. I think the whole responsive design resolution that was kicked off a few years ago has now really matured. So we all know how to design screens and interfaces that adapt according to screen size, which is kind of a commodity nowadays. But then there's more interesting things like proximity, your physical location. This is a product I like. It's the Nest thermostat. I'm sure many of you know this product. The Nest team, I think last year, launched a new iteration of their product called the Nest Farsight. And it really takes into account your physical location. So, for example, when you're far away from the device, it just shows the most basic information, like the current temperature, obviously. But then, if you get closer to the physical device, it actually sends that, and it increases the information density. So it shows like settings and humidity levels and all kinds of, well, data. So they take into account your physical context, your physical location. Then there's stuff like the environmental context, which is also really exciting. At Mirabeau, we're currently working together with KLM to develop a suite of iPad apps for the cabin crew to make their work more efficient and more enjoyable. And what we're currently also testing is a way, an iPad app that helps them be more efficient. And basically, this application has two main use cases. One of them is here. This is the KLM Crew Center, where the crew typically spends like 15 or 10 minutes to prepare their flight. So they get up to speed on whatever's changed to their aircraft or their destination or what the passengers are that are on board. And as you can see, the setting here is pretty comfortable, right? So there's like sofas and good lighting and good coffee. So in terms of the design, we really optimize for comfortable reading long-form text, because they usually have a lot of stuff to catch up with. Now, if you change this context to what's on board, then the whole atmosphere kind of changes, because there are usually a lot of stress involved in preparing the meal servers or other procedures. And there's usually bad lighting, there's maybe turbulence, so the whole context of use is radically different. And the application actually takes this into account and changes the user interface to have more contrast. It increases the UI controls so they're easier to reach. And it really takes into account the context of use on board in the aircraft. And it uses light sensors and all kinds of cool APIs for that, which is really cool. Then there's things like behavior, which we can also anticipate. I'm personally a big fan of Airbnb. I'm sure many of you are as well. And typically what happens if I go to Airbnb to search for an apartment, I return to the same site again over a few days because I'm really picky about my apartment, so I keep searching and searching and searching. And Airbnb knows that, so whenever I get back to Airbnb, they show a quick list of my recent searches, along with the dates and the people, so I can really get up to speed again quickly. Which kind of, if you describe it like this, it seems like a trivial feature, but it actually makes a lot of difference to the user experience. This is another example. This is a website we did last year for a company called Leaseplan, which, as the name suggests, is a company that involved with lease cars. And basically, if you look at it like this, it's kind of a basic homepage, just as you see them all the time. But actually, it gets a lot more interesting as you are, for example, a returning visitor. So when we see from data that you've maybe looked at some specific model, we can show it on the homepage. Or if we see that based on cookies or whatever data that maybe you're up for a new model, we can show specific calculators or tools to help you make the right decision. And actually this kind of personalization really makes a lot of difference when it comes to engagement and all these kind of different metrics. So basically what we did for Leaseplan is develop a custom set of components and dynamic content that creates a different, unique experience for each and every visitor. So no one's actually seeing the same website, which is pretty radical. Now, these are just a few options we have available today to personalize and contextualize our websites and apps. Maybe at this point you're kind of overwhelmed, because I usually get overwhelmed when there are so many opportunities and options. So what I decided to do for this talk is give you a brief overview of how we do design at Mirabeau, our basic design process and the activities involved. We don't usually follow a fixed design process. We tend to tailor our design process to the specific needs of the project, of the client. So for example, depending on ambitions and budgets and the people involved, we can sort of change the design process. But still, there are some fundamental ideas and activities we sort of always do. So I nailed it down to 3 steps for simplicity's sake. And the first steps involve a lot of strategy thinking, a lot of research. And let me demonstrate that by this example. Over the past 2 years, we worked on the big scale redesign of the Transavia website, which is a Dutch airline. We did the whole thing again, like the booking tool, internet check-in, and the whole e-commerce platform, which was a pretty cool project actually, because at some point Transavia decided to launch a major rebranding, and we actually got to work on the design of the aircraft, which is pretty cool if you're working in a digital agency, or at least I think that's so. And at some point, the people of Transavia, they asked us to have a close look at the seat map and the user experience for the seat map, which for them is a really critical application, because nowadays a lot of airline revenue comes from people purchasing better seats with more leg space. And yeah, well, this is what they typically look like, right? They're kind of boring in many ways, but they're basically just a top-down view of the aircraft. So again, this is a really important touch point for Transavia. So we were really focused on delivering a really kick-ass user experience. But we also know that today people are using billions of different kind of devices, and we have to make sure that our product or service works for each and every device, which can be really painful and a lot of difficulties. So at Mirabeau, we tend to favor a specific design philosophy, which is called progressive enhancement. Many of you will have heard of it probably. And basically, progressive enhancement allows us to design products and services that work everywhere. We're not making assumptions about anything, so we're not just designing for people who have JavaScript or who are running the latest Chrome version. We're creating something that works everywhere, even in old hardware. Sounds boring, it's actually pretty exciting. Because, for example, if you use like really old hardware, people are still using these phones, I'm told, especially abroad, I think. Then, in this case, we serve up an UX that is pretty boring. It's just a table, and there's no fonts, no whatsoever. So the experience is pretty basic. And we will not win any Webby awards with this design. We are aware of that. But for example, if you use a newer iPhone, in this case, you get a more suitable and nicer experience. So we load up web fonts and maybe some images to present a relevant experience. And actually, while this may sound pretty nerdy, it's actually pretty liberating, because once we have this basic baseline that works across all devices, we can really go all out with the latest APIs and stuff. So now we have the basics in place. We can enhance it based on, for example, customer context. So again, going back to the Transavia seat map, this is the version you get if you're running a recent version of Chrome, for example. So we're using WebGL rendering, Google Maps, 3D transitions, and CSS transitions to really make the experience worthwhile. But again, as you can imagine, using these kind of animations is kind of hard on hardware because it kind of drains the battery. But in this case, if the website detects that your battery is low, it automatically scales back to a more suitable experience. So we do away with the WebGL rendering and all kinds of fancy stuff and create a more basic version. So hopefully you can finish your transaction or your seats selection process without your battery actually draining. So the design system again adapts to your context, and it makes for a much more relevant and engaging experience. Now, if you're into these nerdy APIs, there's this website called Can I Use, which is basically a list of all the nerdy web APIs that are available, such as the battery status API, which is pretty obscure, but still you can see browser support, and then you can decide for your user group, your target audience, whether it makes sense to even support this. Finally, we have this rigorous testing process at Mirabeau, and we keep improving our designs. So we're not a big fan of projects, mostly. We try to come up with long-term partnerships. For example, with KLM and Transavia, we've been working for them for like many years. And actually, the first version of anything we launch is actually just the first version. We try to stick around, keep learning, measuring actual uses, and keep on improving the whole experience based on that. So we enter this cycle of continuously learning about the things we build and improving them as well. And we also build these dashboards full of analytics and all kinds of data and KPIs. That is particularly useful for people in blue shirts, as you can see. So that's when it comes to data, we're really involved, but we also rigorously test things in usability labs. So we usually invite 6 or 8 people a day, and we make them go through the same seat selection process again to really observe where things are going wrong or where people are struggling. Now, if you happen to think that this was like the best project ever, actually it was not. We had this particular CSS bug which went unnoticed for months by our QA teams until finally some person on Twitter pointed us out, and we actually fixed it. So despite being good in many ways, we still screw up and we fail and we struggle. So we're definitely not the perfect agency in that regard, I think. So to wrap up, designing for context involves thinking big, start small, make something that works everywhere, and then enhance it with context. There are a few things to keep in mind, though, when you're designing products that take into account your context. Then one of the things I often see go wrong is mobile experiences, where people are basically served up lesser versions of the same website that don't have the features or the same content, or are basically broken, and it happens too often, I think. But it also sometimes it happens the other way around. This is a German startup who launched, I think, last year, and their product helps people travel together on train, and by traveling together they can save money on group tickets. This is what you call a typical mobile-first product, but actually in this case they went mobile only. So if you visit the website on a big screen, you actually get nothing, because they didn't prioritize big screens. Probably some kind of MVP decision, I suppose. So we should be careful as designers and developers with removing features or content based on context. Privacy obviously is a big issue as well, or can be a big issue. Spotify had this last year where basically they rewrote their privacy policy and they said, well, we can have access to whatever is on your device. So they keep track of your movements, your location, many different things that people maybe not like so much, because people tend to be careful with privacy and they tend to not like it when companies invade their privacy, even for fighting terrorism. But in this case, Spotify decided to violate their privacy for song recommendations, which is maybe not very much of a good idea. Another example I recently ran into, my girlfriend and I are kind of lazy people, so we tend to use each other hardware and devices. So in this case, and this is like the biggest cliche in the history of cliches, but she went shopping for high heels on my MacBook. And I'm actually not sure whether she made the actual purchase, but what I do know is that for the next few weeks, my entire web experience was all about advertising, and I kept seeing the same shoes everywhere. Which maybe, if you look at it from the seller's perspective, like the company behind it, maybe it leads to more sales. But in my case, I was kind of like, well, I felt followed and, was not so good in that regard, I think. So we should be careful with privacy and context. Now, finally, a brief outlook into the future of product design. Obviously, as you all agree, there will be more devices, many more devices in cars and all kinds of other really exciting stuff. Actually, this mock-up, I always thought that the refrigerator on the right was like a fake product, like a mock-up. But actually, it exists. It's a real thing you can buy today. I think it's made by Samsung. And it's really nice, and it helps you to keep track of your Dropbox and your Evernote comments and all kinds of crazy stuff that you're actually going to wonder, is this actually useful to do on a refrigerator? I think as designers and developers, we should be more restrictive, or at least consider the context of use and maybe ask ourselves whether it makes sense to put this kind of technology on the screen on a refrigerator. This is another ridiculous example I came across recently. It's a wine bottle with a touchscreen and Wi-Fi, which is cool, right? Because it helps you to select new wines and read up on your current wine. And, well, it only cost $190, so why not? I mean, yeah, it's cool. Or maybe not, I don't know. Again, we should be careful but not put screens everywhere, but really consider the context of use and see whether it makes sense to put screens or Wi-Fi or anything else in there. So to wrap up, I think as technology blends into every aspect of our lives, and it increasingly does, I think as designers and developers we should be more aware of it and consider the context of use, and the adapt to context becomes more urgent. So there will be more devices. Gartner, I think, I recently read a projection. They say there'll be like 26 billion devices in 2020, which to me always sounds like the Jetsons age. 2020 is like far away from now, but it's actually just 3 years. So we're pretty close to it. But then even more funny, you have Cisco that says, no, there'll be 50 billion devices, which is even more. And then there's Intel saying, no, you guys are all wrong. It's going to be 200 billion devices, which is a crazy number again. But I think we shouldn't really be debating these kind of numbers or projections. I think as an industry and as professionals and designers and technologists, we should ask ourselves a much more fundamental question, which is, are we ready for this future? Thanks. That was my talk.